Welcome back. This is a mini lecture um, in Gender 2000 under the Ancient Cultures unit, and we are looking in this lecture at the Israeli people and one of the foundational texts of their culture, the Bible. And I want to sort of set up the context of studying the Bible as an academic area of interest. Specifically, we're looking at the text to see how men and women were treated differently and how they were understood to be in ancient Israeli culture. The Bible, as most people know it, as that book that you might find in old hotel rooms when you open a drawer, um, is a product of a number of different ancient times and cultures. And what we are most familiar with in the United States is the Christian Bible, which is split into a number of sections, Old Testament and New Testament. Um, as we go into class, we'll talk maybe a little bit more about the Christian side. But that Old Testament part is all the foundational sacred documents that were canonized into a text for the ancient Hebrew people. They are religious, they are cultural, they are historical. Um, they are really the most important writings that that culture had at the sort of origin point of the culture, if we understand that to be when they begin writing and keeping records. So, because it is a sacred text and because there are still people who follow this religion. It isn't like an ancient Greek or Roman pantheon of gods. Um, we want to be sure that we are being respectful of it. Both people of Christian faith and Islamic faith also follow these texts and hold them sacred, as well as Jewish people. So um, as we discuss it, look at it for what it says literarily, how meanings are made within the text. Look at as look at it as an artifact of history. Look at it as a vehicle for ideology and understanding, um, while keeping in mind that some aspects of the text are going to be a little bit beyond us because we are not the original intended audience at the original time that these texts were perhaps most directly useful to people, particularly in that historical context. As we talk about it, too, please be aware that the Bible is a collection of diverse texts. It is not a single complete document. Um, Not one person sat down and said, I'm going to start writing the Bible, and they began writing it in chapter one and then finished it at the end and said, okay, I'm done. Send it to the publisher. That the process of writing in the ancient culture was not like modern publishing, and that the Bible contains many documents from many different sets of Israeli people across a large time span, and that the texts themselves are of very different, um, I'll say, of very different genres. So you'll see poetry, you'll see narratives, you'll see prayers, you'll see laws, you'll see genealogies, and um, they each have a different purpose for why they are written and a different purpose for why they are shared amongst others. And again, it can be difficult for a modern person reading it in English to get all the nuances that might have been there. If you could read it in ancient Hebrew or ancient Aramaic or ancient Greek, um, as well as the cultural understandings that may be lost and that you have to go to outside historical sources to understand. And some of that, of course, is what I attempt to do for you in this lecture and perhaps in the next. So, studying it in a secular environment, it's important to note that although it's a religious text for many people, we will not be looking at that way. This is not about what you should believe or what you should understand, what you should know. Um, your religious nature or lack thereof is up to you. Um, Furthering on that idea, you should know that other people do hold it as a very sacred text, and so be respectful. But for our purposes, we're going to look at the human history of the text and agree on the idea that even if God's inspiration or revelations are directly given to Moses, as uh, the ancient Hebrew tradition holds, that it is people, perhaps Moses at the beginning, or perhaps other people, um, across time that are going to be putting, um, pen or pencil to paper, if you were, and recording those words and transcribing those words and copying those words as they make other copies, distribute them, share them, um, etc. So um, we'll hold then that God, him, her, them, they itself did not put a single word of this onto paper, parchment, or papyrus, and that people did that across a long period of time. People with different interests behind them, which can be important because people might have biases that they are or are not aware of, that can influence how they see the world, and how they see the world can change what the words are that they write sometimes. So keep an open mind um, as we look at what is really a very complex text. And also understand that because it's a religious document, you might see it referred to by people who have different beliefs about it. And one belief that has been, let's say, predominant sometimes historically is the idea of biblical inerrancy. This is largely held by people who might have a more fundamentalist belief in the text, where they are looking at the text more literally than other people, believers or otherwise, might have. And biblical inerrancy is the idea that there are no errors in the Bible, which can force people to make sense of the senseless, particularly in a document as large and complex and layered as the Bible. So there are different degrees of biblical inerrancy. There are people who will believe that everything in there is the true word of God, but they can understand that word somewhat metaphorically or allegorically or symbolically. And then there are other people who will believe that there are no mistakes, and it doesn't matter which version of the Bible you read, that every version is the truth and must be sort of taken as the truth. Um, this can be challenging because there are a number of different uh, Jewish and Christian sects that use the Bible in religious ways, that use it to inform their current cultural practices. Um, all of those different sects will usually have their own translation, their own interpretation, their own arrangement of the texts. They might not always include the same texts. So obviously a Judaic Bible is going to be missing that Christian New Testament part entirely. And just what texts you include and what texts you exclude are going to perhaps influence how you see the world and how you understand what the words that you see mean. So in this class, I would like everyone to see the Bible as a literary and historical document, and understand that it is the cultural heritage of everybody in Western culture, um, that the many things in the Israeli belief system, way of life, become subsumed within the Greco-Roman Empire and influence us even still today. Um, and so it's very important in that way. Now, when we study the Bible, academically speaking, there is the understanding that you need a bunch of skills because it is an ancient text, because it was um, written and recorded in the Near East in ancient times, that there are cultural and archaeological and literary and epigraphical materials um, that are things that speak to the text itself and things that give us a greater understanding of what the texts are and what they should mean, etc. Um, when we study the Bible in that way, we're doing what is called biblical exegesis. So we're looking at what the words say, we're looking at the ideology behind them, we're looking at the values, we're looking at both sort of literal and allegorical and symbolic meaning. We're looking at the theology, we're looking at the um, uh, the cultural traditions that produce the book and the books. We're looking at the cultural traditions that get formed by the words in the book. And we're looking sometimes at the cultural traditions that are influenced now because of words in this ancient book. Um, when I talked about biblical inerrancy and making sense of the senseless, you should note that that's particularly challenging sometimes for the Bible because of how long it takes to produce it, how many different types of literature are in it, and because sometimes you will find things, stories in the text that are repeated a number of times with small changes to the details. And what the true meaning is of one of those stories then is something that is definitely open to argumentation and interpretation. And so someone who sees three different versions of something as all being equally true are having to come up with explanations for how that is in their brains, um, that may, you know, both agree or disagree with how someone else comes up with how those meanings must all then be true. So it can get kind of complicated. Um, Most of our biblical exegesis of a high scholarship quality comes after 1943, when Pope Pius XII opens the doors to the Vatican's library for religious scholars, and also for philosophical scholars and historians to come in. Pope Pius is very sensitive at that time to new theories that are and new technologies that are going through culture. So Darwin's idea of the evolution of the species um, might seem to contradict some things that are written in the biblical text. Certainly, there's nothing in the biblical text about the process of evolution. And so certain religious believers might reject it. Um, Also, radiocarbon dating, which allows people to, um, use technology to determine how old texts are. Chemical analyses, which allow people to see what the texts are made of, what the inks are made of, where they likely are developed, where the sources come from, all become tools that scientists and historians and humanists and philosophers and religious practitioners can use to make sense of all of the different variants that they find. Um, and it should be noted too that when Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, that the church tries to control people's access to the religious text and have, you know, the variants sort of contained. And they do that by purchasing or sometimes maybe accepting stolen documents from people who are helping them in that effort. And they really acquire a lot of components of, various sets of the ancient Judaic texts as well as the early Christian texts. So when they opened the library, that was somewhat unprecedented. Um, and they set up practices so that the texts themselves are um, as little damaged as possible. And the scholars begin to do their work of analysis on these very complex texts. To illustrate this complexity that I keep talking about, I want to talk about the Torah as an example. The Torah is the five books that come first in the arrangement of the text in the ancient Hebrew scriptures. It's sometimes referred to in the scholarship as the Pentateuch or the five scrolls. That comes from the Greek. The Torah is the teaching, the scripture, or sometimes in older texts it's referred to as the law of the Israeli people. It covers about the first 700 years of ancient Israel's existence. So that's about 2000 to 1250 before the Common Era. And these first five books are going to be collected um, and become what we call salvation history around 500 BCE. And salvation histories are texts that explain religious and cultural values and histories of people. And they generally are authored at times of cultural crisis, where the people within the crisis see that they're at sort of that turning point or inflection point between um, going on in a status quo or failing, entirely. Um, in the Torah, it is a story of the Israeli people's relationship to their God. And as we will see, the God's relationship back to them. Um, and throughout those first five books, it really will capture that idea of the uncertainty and the warlike nature of the Israeli people. It will record who their allies are, who their enemies are, um, their perspectives of various battles, what they accomplish, what they don't accomplish, etc. So again, those first five books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. On the slide, I have a picture of the oldest surviving manuscript of the Bible, the Codex Leningradenus, which dates to 1008 of the Common Era. So what you should first notice, of course, is that if we put the Common Era at about the time of Christ's birth or death, that we're looking at a text that is collected and assembled 1,000 years after that, and that's a long time. You'll also notice from the picture that it is not written in English, and that also um, allows for various elements that can lead to different interpretations and different understandings of the text in it, because most of us, at least, are going to be accessing it from English, and sometimes we're reading English that gets translated from ancient Aramaic, ancient Greek, Latin, or even other languages, sometimes Egyptian. So when those translators translate it, they are going to sometimes pick the closest word that they can think of to try to convey the idea. There's a question of whether they have that original idea well enough in the first place, if they are translating it and not of the ancient Hebrew culture themselves. Um, they might make mistakes. Those mistakes might then work their way into subsequent translations. Um, and also, you might have transcription errors because, again, there's no Xerox machine in the ancient world. You need humans to copy the text. And sometimes people who were illiterate got paid as scribes to copy texts. So they might draw a character incorrectly and accidentally sort of introduce a different meaning to the text. So again, it can be a very complicated business to try to figure out what the meaning of any of these things is. So traditionally, as has been mentioned, the idea is that Moses speaks to God on Mount Sinai, and God gives Moses the Ten Commandments and traditionally the rest of the Torah. Nowhere in the Torah does it claim that Moses writes the text. There is no byline, there is no Holy Bible written by Moses. He doesn't write it out like a will, I, Moses, being of sound mind and body, hereby record what God told me, word for word, verbatim, so that there's no question for history in the future. Um, and certainly that idea or that claim that is probably meant, more symbolically and figuratively than literally in the first place. That claim that Moses is the author of the first five books have been questioned for a long time, because historians and religious leaders alike question how someone who dies within the text could be writing about things that happen after his own death. Um, it is possible, of course, if you read the ancient Hebrew text, that you will see um, that God, being all-knowing and all-powerful, might certainly ask Moses to write things down and tell him what happens after he dies. Some religious people, some philosophers might think it's unlikely. They might think God would not be cruel enough to tell someone what's going to happen to all his kids' generations beyond, and subject him to that. Others might say the God of the Old Testament is one that might very well do that. But there are certainly many other details that leads biblical scholars to believe that one person did not write the first five books of the Bible, much less all of the rest of them. Um, and so we'll talk just a little bit quickly here about what some of those conclusions are. Um, and it should be noted that historians, archaeologists, uh, scientists who are carbon dating the materials, and literary scholars who are looking at similarities in style or patterns of word use will look to see um, where there are certain things that seem to be the work of the same or similar people throughout the larger text. So, similarly to ways that people would ascertain, um, whether a Hemingway text is really written by Hemingway, if one should be found in someone's attic suddenly. Can you tell the writer's style? Um, Are the characters written the same way? Does it seem to be on the same paper as a different text? Um, are the spellings consistent with this other person? All of those things will go into deciding who writes what part of the Bible. And when I say who writes what part of the Bible, these are ancient texts we assume that they are probably old rabbis or people educated in the philosophy, law, theology, etc., at least initially. But then again, over time, it can be a scribe, it can be a lesser rabbi, it can be a student who is not, you know, yet indoctrinated in the full authority of the church, etc. Um, what scholars conclude is that once the texts are written, they don't necessarily attain the same level of sacredness all the time, um, either, that they sort of come in and go out of favor depending on what the people at the time need. Um, and we see a further complication that there are editors, which they will call redactors in biblical studies, who will make up finished versions of texts out of, you know, supposedly original pieces or alternate versions of pieces that they find, um, who will rearrange the order of the texts, who will sometimes insert their own explanations, or who will occasionally change a few of the words in a particular narrative, or a particular law for a particular purpose at a particular time. So, in addition to writers, you've got basically religious and ideological editors over time who are going to switch things around. Which leads me to another point I'd like to make about ancient texts, and that is that um, in the ancient world, most people are not literate, and the materials to write things are precious. The resources that you would use are precious. Making papyrus is difficult. Making vellum is difficult. You know, creating paper is difficult. Takes a lot of time. Um, Creating ink, maybe not quite so hard, but still requires effort. Learning on these ancient texts takes time. And if there's a question of religious sacredness, someone doesn't want to just crumple up a bad version and throw it into the garbage bin. Um, you know, there's a certain solemnity with the act of rewriting or copying that gets preserved as well. Likewise, in the ancient world, you don't understand plagiarism the way we do in the modern world either. So, you know, using this text is not really, you know, stealing someone else's words that they have a financial interest in. These texts are culturally held. They're seen to be the property of the whole people, and they want to be shared and distributed amongst their people. And when Greek and Rome become involved in later Christianity, they are going to want copies of these texts too. So, um, you know, they are not convinced at any one time that their interpretation is the be all end all interpretation. And so if a document is sacred and they make a copy, they might be handing that copy to someone else, or they might be just putting it in front of their old copy because they like their version a little bit better and it speaks more to their people than a version from 2 or 3 or 4 generations away did. So the texts themselves, religious and otherwise, in the ancient world are pretty precious. And they can be a sign of wealth, both to an individual who has them, to a church that has them, and to the community where they are housed and kept. Which brings me all to biblical scholars' conclusions about that, let's say, unifying of the document, which they call the documentary theory, which holds that the Bible is the product of repeated processes of creation, revision, deletion, editing, arranging, creating, revising, deleting, editing, arranging, over a long period of time by a great number of people. And this theory explains why you'll find similar tales, similar laws, similar collections of ideas in different places, in different books, in different orders. And this is thought to explain both to skeptics and believers that the text itself is still really valid, that you have to approach it in a different way than you would, a modern biology textbook or a modern geology textbook. A biblical scholar who became famous after September 11th, Karen Armstrong, admits that, quote, we cannot treat the Bible as a holy encyclopedia where we look up information about the divine because we are likely to find contradictory data in the next chapter, end quote. Her theory or rationalization is that by, quote, presenting readers with more than one story, the editors were demonstrating that no one human account can ever comprise the whole of divine truth, end quote. So, all the different pieces that get produced over the course of 700 or more years by the ancient Israeli people are doing their best to simulate divine truth, which no human can ever really know. Um, what truths we can know or what truths we think we know um, will be part of this next lecture, and we'll look at some specific writers and what we see them doing in the early couple chapters of the Bible.